For our panel of witnesses today, we're pleased to welcome from the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Jason Jacques, Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer, Mark Mahabir, Director General, Costing and Budgetary Analysis and General Counsel, Christina Grinspoon, Director, Fiscal Analysis, and Diara Surang, Director, Economic Analysis, as well as Jason Stanton, Advisor Analyst. Welcome, and thank you for accepting our invitation to appear today. We will now hear opening remarks from Mr. Jacques, and then we'll have questions. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear today. Since my last appearance before the committee in early December, we have published 10 reports directly related to Budget 2025 and matters studied by Parliament. Among them is an initial assessment of the government's planned spending cuts as part of the Comprehensive Expenditure Review and the $1 trillion investment included in Budget 2025. I will answer your questions about these reports, but allow me to follow up on our report on the issues related to Budget 2025. I will now continue in English.
I wanted to follow up on previous testimony we provided to the committee regarding our Budget 2025 issues report. Members will recall we highlighted concerns regarding the government's decision to abandon its debt-to-GDP fiscal anchor and its overly broad definition of capital as part of the new operating budget fiscal anchor. Last month, the International Monetary Fund published its Article 4 consultation report on Canada. The IMF also concluded that, quote, a clear debt-to-GDP anchor should remain central to the fiscal framework, extending Canada's strong tradition of fiscal prudence, end quote. In addition, it noted that the government's new definition of capital remains, and I'll quote, broad, and would benefit from closer alignment with existing standards used by Statistics Canada and other countries. We encourage parliamentarians to follow the progress made by the government in implementing the International Monetary Fund's recommendations. I also wanted to seek the committee's assistance in resolving a problem we currently have regarding information access. Consistent with the Parliament of Canada Act, last month we requested information from all departments and agencies subject to the Comprehensive Expenditure Review. All but one single, lonely organization provided us with the information requested. The organization that did not get back to us is Library and Archives Canada. By our assessment, this organization is legally required to provide us with the information requested. We respectfully ask the committee to consider a motion requiring this organization to provide us with the information immediately. I will now continue in French. En conclusion, je tiens à dire que notre bureau.
In closing, I would like to say that my office remains determined to provide Parliament with clear, timely, and impartial analyses to help you in your study of federal expenses and budgetary policy. We appreciate the committee's constructive engagement in favor of transparency and accountability in the federal budget process. My colleagues and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Jacques. Donc, première question, Sénateur.
Thank you. First question, Senator Forêt. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here. In your document, you talk about $100 billion in investment generated by the federal government, but in the election platform, they talked about $500 billion in private investment generated by federal investment. I believe you've tried to understand the difference between the $500 billion and the other figure. Can you tell us why there's a difference? Because that's a big impact on partners. I'm thinking of municipalities, among other partners, that have a high level of debt, and that debt will continue to grow with this approach. Regarding the difference you mentioned, it's important to differentiate between the figures in the Liberal electoral platform and the budget figure, because those figures are not related. When the government says they are going to invest $280 billion to support third parties, that is the stepping stone that will lead us to the $1,000 billion. But only $41 billion of that $280 billion comes from the 2025 budget. The remainder comes from measures that were already in place before budget 2025. So we are looking at the $41 billion that is going to generate about $106 billion for the next 5 years until 2029-2030. So those two figures are the key figures. $41 billion of net investment in budget 2025, and the $126 billion. So $41 billion from the federal government, $85 billion from the private sector. So generally, federal government programs are paid for in 3 parts: a third from the federal government, a third from the provincial government, a third from the municipal government. So that seems to be the formula used here. There's not a lot of room to generate private investment. That $41 billion includes many programs, including infrastructure. So for infrastructure, the rule of thirds still holds, but the other levels don't have the same obligations when it comes to investments. There are different multipliers that are used. Did you analyze the types of investments that can generate results in an optimal fashion? I'm thinking of public services, housing, roads, etc. Did you do an analysis to understand what type of infrastructure is the best when it comes to creating more impact? We didn't have a chance to do it within this study. The goal here was to explain where the $1,000 billion came from, because there seemed to be some confusion. We wanted to really explain the relationship between the $280 billion that had been announced and the results that were expected. Inaudible. So if you want to find the new money, you have to be a very good analyst, correct? Yes, indeed, there was a lot of money that was already available, about $900 billion was already in the economy. Thank you. Senator Cardozo. Thank you, Chair.
Your colleagues. My question is about youth unemployment, and it may be very specific. I don't know if you can help me here or you can get back to us. But the way I look at it, and I'd like you to confirm the way I'm analyzing it, the youth unemployment rate is 14.1, roughly twice that of the population at large. According to my calculations, that comes to about 370,000 young people. In Budget 2025, the government has introduced, we'll once again have the Canada Summer Jobs Program. So for about 300 million this year and next year, there will be jobs for 100,000, but only for 8 weeks, as opposed to 52 weeks, or even as opposed to 16 weeks that full-time students are available for. Would you agree with those figures, 370,000, 100,000 for 8 weeks, as opposed to 370,000 for 52 weeks? The point I'm making is I think that from what I'm seeing, we have a growing youth unemployment crisis. What we're doing is similar to the programs we've had for many years. They're covering something like 10% of the problem.
So the numbers you cited are numbers that we follow very closely. In terms of the total total number of youth unemployed, I think the most recent number I'm familiar with was just over 400,000. So 400,000 kids between the ages of 15 and 24 who are looking for full-time work or looking for work who can't get work. In terms of the 14% plus unemployment rate, it is more than double. It's come down a little bit for that segment, but it's still quite high, especially in comparison to where we were prior to the pandemic. The other element, it's not the mandate of the office to comment on government policy or what the government should be doing. I would say from an academic research perspective, and I have a 17-year-old son at home, so I feel it near and dear to my heart. Where you start your career and how you start your career has a very poignant and prominent influence over the trajectory of your career. So if you are not able to find that first job or find a first job related to your studies, chances are your attachment to the labor force writ large over your lifetime, and certainly your lifetime earnings, will be lower, which means that potentially the tax base and nominal GDP and the productivity of those individuals, there could also be an impact on that as well. And I think that sometimes that's something that is forgotten. Both the current situation obviously is quite pernicious and challenging if you're one of those kids between the ages of 15 and 24, but more broadly looking at the selfish interests of the people in Ottawa and myself wanting to see those budgetary revenues go up both now and over a longer term period of time. Making those investments and providing those supports now potentially provides a very substantial return.
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond, certainly the pernicious part is that their trajectory won't be as well as others, but given the rapid advancement of technology in the workplace, they get further left behind by not having had that kind of technological work experience. There are a couple of other programs, if I may, that deal with the Youth Employment Skills Strategy and the Student Work Placement Program. There is there's also the Youth Corps, the Climate Corps, which only provides 500 jobs, if that's correct. My question is, if the government took the summer jobs program and doubled the number of students, instead of 100,000 provide employment for 200,000, if it did 16 weeks instead of 8 weeks for every student, because really 8 weeks you don't get much experience, you don't earn much money, and made the program eligible for non-students, just young people within that age. I would also argue that we should be looking till the age 29, just because people in that age group live the same circumstances as younger people in terms of not having permanent jobs, not having permanent homes, and live that same level of uncertainty as younger people do. Would that not be an efficient way of expanding the program, given that thousands of people have applied for this program, and employers have applied for it, employees have applied for it? The government has a way of going through these applications and getting the money. Would expanding the current program be an efficient way of employing more youth?
Is a very good question that is outside the mandate and the remit of the Parliamentary Budget Office. That said, if you'd like a cost estimate, I would encourage you to table a motion or present a motion in the Senate, and we would be happy to look at that proposal and potentially put some crunchier numbers around it for you.
I'd be happy to do that. Thanks so much. Thanks for your answers.
Merci beaucoup, Senator Ross.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for being with us today. I'm wondering if you can give me a little extra information on the cuts that would impact ACOA. In Atlantic Canada, we're seeing some layoffs, job losses. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of if you have any information on whether that's mostly attrition or layoffs? What programs will be cut? And one of the things that is a concern for me is that every dollar that a COA invests usually leverages somewhere between $2 and $3 of other money. So do you have a sense of the loss to the economy if they're cutting in some of that spending as well? And the $1.5 billion in savings that is across all 5 agencies, how much of that will impact COA? And on a completely other note, my other question is, what were the pieces of information that you were requesting from the Library and Archives Canada that you weren't able to obtain from them?
Sure. I'll start with your question with respect to ACOA, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Mr. Stanton, regarding Library and Archives Canada. So we do have detailed information from ACOA with respect to the cuts that they intend to put into effect across program area and along with FTE impacts and dollar impacts, along with the agency's assessment of what those impacts will be. So we asked them from a service level perspective whether those impacts would have effectively a low, medium, or high impact, risk impact on service levels for existing programs. ACOA has designated that information as confidential. So we're not in a position necessarily to share it at this point. I would say, from our perspective, we've been clear that we don't agree with the confidentiality that departments have insisted upon. And having been before this committee in the past, we've indicated, or we've highlighted research that indicates actually transparency works to everybody's advantage when there are tough restraint measures or cuts that are going through the system, so parliamentarians can debate, understand, discuss, debate, and build buy-in from the broader public. I understand at this point that there is additional information that the government intends to release over the coming weeks with respect to the cuts by program on ACOA at this point. But they are all very legitimate questions that are, at this point, best put to ACOA.
So when you receive that information, if they're going to release some of it as being not confidential, would you be able to share that with us?
Absolutely. As soon as the nature of the confidentiality cited by the government at this point is they need to let their staff know. And from our perspective, as soon as the government tables the main estimates, which is linked to an appropriation bill which has the cuts included in it, at that point it's under debate by Parliament and under discussion by Parliament. So any erstwhile confidentiality is kind of put by the wayside because parliamentarians are debating it, and parliamentarians will need to vote on cuts to ACOA across program lines, and people need to know what they're voting on.
So whether it's the programs themselves that are being cut or the people that implement those programs, that both of those pieces of information are very important in Atlantic Canada.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I got you. And sorry, Jay?
Yeah, so in terms of Library and Archives Canada, they did not provide us any additional information that wasn't included in the budget. So for all 83 organizations that were included as part of Annex 3 of the budget, we were seeking additional information on the savings by program, so the dollar values by program, FTE reductions, as well as any impact on service levels. All organizations responded. However, Library and Archives did not provide any additional information that we were seeking for that breakout. So that it's a consistent request that we asked all organizations. They were the only one who didn't provide any of the additional details we were seeking.
So was their response, we will not provide, or just here's what we've already shared and we'll reshare it with you?
It was kind of the same language of that, primarily that they weren't able to share due to not notifying their employees out of potential cuts, as well as, so that was kind of the language that they had used.
And other departments from which you requested that information that were also impacting employees, they were able to share that information?
So it varied. So a lot of organizations did provide all the information that we had requested. Some provided some additional information, which we kind of categorized as partially disclosed. And in this case, Library and Archive did not provide any additional information. But it did vary between certain organizations provided some additional details by program, some on FTEs, some service level, but maybe not all of it. But this was the only organization that didn't provide anything additional that we had asked for.
Thank you very much.
Ross, next question, Senator Galvez.
Bonne année, Monsieur le Président.
Merci à vous aussi.
Bonne année. The government's new capital budgeting framework gives the deficit a makeover. We agree with that. It recasts almost every dollar as an investment, and the plan promises to balance day-to-day spending with revenues by 29, while nearly doubling the capital expenditures from 32 to in 24 to almost 60 billion by 29-30. They promise to spur productivity and long-term growth. By then, the 100% of the deficit will be branded as investment spending. But, when I read the budget, it does not offer a metric of return, as we are talking. It does, or as my colleague, Senator Foré, said, there is no measure of efficiency. And for me, in particular, more important, no test of climate alignment on whether these new 40 billions are building real resilience or simply deepening our debt. So my questions are, based on the data that you were able to obtain, how would you rate the anticipated efficiency in comparisons to current process and approaches? I'm sure you have done this exercise in the past for other budgets, your office, so I would like to know. And based on the data that you receive, what metric of return might be applied to this new way that the government is presenting the budget as investment? And then I have another question.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I will definitely avoid providing an overall rating regarding efficiency for the government's budget for a 400-plus page document with a lot of complex calculations. That said, on our end, the rate of return for the investments is something that's important. It's something that DRA incorporates as part of the macroeconomic forecast because, of course, a dollar of consumption spending is not equivalent to a dollar of investment spending. And going back to a question that was asked earlier, not all investment spending is created equal in the same way that not all consumption spending is created equal. If you give an additional dollar to a billionaire, chances are they'll save it and potentially put it into an offshore tax haven. You give an additional dollar to someone who's below the poverty line, they'll probably spend it on food or an essential, which definitely has a differential impact in the economy. What I'd suggest is, and given the interest from the committee, if there was a motion from the committee for us to undertake a more detailed study with respect to the differential rates of return on investment in the budget, that's something we'd be very happy to undertake. And I think it would be a natural extension of the work that we already do within the office, and especially given the government's emphasis on capital, both the traditional definition and a broader definition.
I will note that for the future to make this motion. Do I have time for just one little question? Okay.
1 minute.
So we know that 83 federal government organizations are target to spending reductions, and this was like an horizontal cut. But I wrote in an op-ed that that's a very inefficient way of doing cuts, because on what you base these horizontal cuts when more efficient cuts can be done. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on, have you seen in other reduction planning how this can affect, again, the efficiency of the new investment, the little new investments that we are putting on the table on this budget?
Thanks for the question. So the motivation, I'd speak to the motivation for us sending out the request to 83 organizations to get a sense of what the cuts are, because of course as part of the restraint exercise, it's a big chunk of change. It's directly related to the government's fiscal anchors and its ability to balance the operating budget over the next 3 years. And what we were most interested in was, are there plans in place? So is there, based upon the $60 billion in savings and the 16,000 plus maybe, I guess, 40,000 full-time equivalents that they're planning on potentially getting rid of. Was there a plan in place to actually achieve that? And that's important because if there isn't a detailed plan from the bottom up that adds up to the public numbers in the budget, on our end it gives us pause regarding whether it's actually a credible plan to actually achieve the savings. At this point, we're still analyzing the figures that have been provided by departments. We're not in a situation at this point where we can reconcile the total FTE savings. So 2 weeks ago, we published a quick summary of, based upon what departments have provided to us, can we add up to the 16,000 FTE figure that was announced in the budget? We're currently not in a position to do that, even with the additional information that's trickled in over the past 2 weeks. So that certainly gives us pause regarding the plans that are in place. The other thing we haven't looked at, because we haven't had to at this point, but you've asked about, and it's a very legitimate question, is around the service level impacts. Because, of course, public servants don't hire themselves. Public servants are hired by the government to implement programs for Canadians. And we have asked questions about service level impacts. Virtually every department and agency has responded to say that they will be low or limited. From our perspective, we've simply tested and asked, do you have plans, and is there potentially a risk that once these are being implemented, there's some sort of pushback from the beneficiaries of these existing programs? The response from government departments is effectively no. That said, we have not seen those plans. We haven't asked for those plans. And that's something I would say, as an agent of Parliament, the questions we ask meet our narrow needs. Potentially, they don't fully meet the needs of parliamentarians in determining that if there are cuts to ACOA, for instance, whether those cuts from the perspective of the Senate or from parliamentarians actually will impact service levels in a way that the government didn't fully anticipate. But that's something we haven't looked at, and that's why we're encouraging the government to be more transparent on releasing the information around the cuts by program.
Merci beaucoup, Sénateur Jacques.
Merci. Bon matin. Bienvenue. J'espère que ma voix ne me lâchera pas durant ma...
Thank you. Welcome. I hope I won't lose my voice as I'm speaking. We're studying C15, and you published a few reports since mid-December. One of them is a change to the law allowing certain loans. And under Section 8 of that law, the government usually tables a report every 3 years on the amount of debt of loans and explains why. So in your note, you said there's not very much in the budget to explain why, after only 18 months, the government is suggesting that we increase the debt ceiling. As parliamentarians, is there information that we could ask for? It's very unusual to act this way, and it would be useful to have more information.
So in terms of the Borrowing Authority Act, we've received information on the additional borrowing that the government is requesting, and kind of the breakdown of the incremental borrowing, whether it's coming from the budget itself or whether it's borrowing coming from Crown corporations. We've posted that we posted information on the blog post that we had before we received that information, and some of those numbers are a bit different just based on when those estimates were made exactly. But in terms of the information that you could ask for is you could ask for additional information on where that borrowing is coming from, and we can also provide the additional information in a supplementary information on our blog post.
So, according to your paper that you have released on December 15, you mentioned that looked like more 4 years rather than 3 years in terms of because usually it's on 3 years, but you refer that maybe this increase is so significant, look like 4 years fiscal year rather than 3.
The increase is until, the borrowing is until 28 to 29. That's when they asked for. So we're anticipating that, the government is anticipating that what they've asked for would be sufficient until 28, 29, including a buffer as well in there.
Okay. So that's my reading too. So they create a significant buffer if anything happen in the coming year or two. So they have no necessity to be back to us. It will. Okay.
Billion in buffer.
It's not the first time that happened during the pandemic as well.
There's usually a buffer when they set the borrowing amount. Yes.
So shifting topic, but it's related to financial viability. You have released a report as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's in mid-December as well about the sustainability of public finance. So in budget 2022, 2024, you mentioned to us that the government has a lot of maneuvering room to spend. But that maneuvering room, I think, is gone now with the budget 2025, defined as maintaining over the long term the debt-to-GDP ratio stable. So if they want to maintain the debt-to-GDP ratio stable over the next 25 years, all the maneuvering room that you have posed in 2024, 2022 is gone now. Is it correct reading?
The report that we wrote essentially took the government's budget numbers and calculated the fiscal gap, and we did show that there's very little fiscal gap remaining. And like you said previously, they had a lot more fiscal room before, but budget 2025 used a lot of that fiscal room, so now they have a lot less fiscal room to maneuver.
I tried to reconcile, Mr. Chair, the statement from Mr. Pierre Leblanc on the conference call regarding the briefing of the new bill coming on the rebate of GST. They mentioned the government has a maneuvering room to allow the 3 billion this year and 12 billion over the next 5 years. He mentioned that Canada has the maneuvering room for that. They have a good financial situation. I could agree or disagree. I think I could agree easily on the debt to GDP. But what is your reading? Government could afford to go ahead with a new fiscal spending like that without putting at risk our rating agency? And is it net to GDP ratio the best ratio, or is it another ratio to use when you compare with other OECD countries? I just try to assess the fact that the government is in a good financial situation, and you are independent as a PBO, so I'm just curious to have your interpretation of that.
Okay, thanks. So in terms of, as Christina mentioned, comme Christina a mentionné, nous avons identifié...
As Christina mentioned, we identified that there's still $4 billion per year in official room, according to our calculations, for the Government of Canada to increase spending or implement a reduction in revenue. With C-19, it's about $2 billion each year, and there would be enough room for that. In the current context, when you look at the rating agencies that look at Canada and debt, it's always important to look at general aspects and not only the federal government, because there's also the context of the provinces and of Canadians, because the debt level per capita for Canadians is the highest within all the G7 countries. For each family in Canada, the per capita rate is the highest among all the G7 countries. The rate of debt, the debt level is ranked second among all G7 countries. So it's important to look at what the Government of Canada is doing, but also to look at the general level of debt throughout Canada. There are some 41 billion people who have responsibilities and net debt. Thank you, Senator Dalphond. Thank you. Excellent questions from Senator Gignac, who covered some of my questions already. But just to continue a little further, in the diagram at the end of your report, the wiggle room was pretty much used up. You said that there's $4 billion left of room, and there will be $2 billion left before indebtedness increases when it comes to the ratio that we are aiming for. Does that mean that we're in a situation where if ever CUSMA could not be renewed, if there was a major crisis in the immediate, that we would have no wiggle room? It's a wonderful question. I have to say that that is the previous budget, and the current government decided to question inaudible answer. Yes, in Budget 2025, there are discussions with parliamentarians. In our opinion, there's no magical ratio for debt to GDP. The more important thing to look at is not the current situation, but the tendency in the future and the ability for Canada to withstand any shocks to the system, like what we saw with the U.S., other geopolitical shocks. The higher the debt, the lower the capacity to respond to shocks. For economists, it's always important to maintain a capacity to respond to emergencies or shocks. And finally, there's a link with your colleague's question, because there's debt, there's GDP, and the Canadian government's budgetary policy and objectives is to increase the growth of the Canadian economy by increasing investment. So that should work, but there's also the question of the capacity of the government and Canadians to implement investment. And so, of course, we're following the figures each day. So if ever the GDP were to get smaller, then we would have to increase our borrowing to maintain programs. The 41% would increase.
Is one of the most indebted country of the G7, so that's going to be to increase our record on that picture.
C'est ça. Et je pense que je dois dire que le Canada ne...
That's right. And I have to say that the government of Canada would go bankrupt tomorrow. There's no risk today. It's not a question of current levels. It's a question of tendencies that we're observing. Compared to the past, the situation is much more difficult today. It's much harder for the government of Canada and for provinces and for each and every Canadian, and we can see that looking at other data for Canadians, and that is the reason why it is important to be very careful about each dollar that is spent and each dollar that comes in as revenue, because those dollars come from the pockets of Canadians. How long do I have left? In the other study you did on returns on investment, the multiples are very interesting, because in the private sector we're looking at 4, 6, 8 R&D, etc. In infrastructure we're looking at ratios of 2 or 3%. So is it wrong? Because in the budget, the increases in spending don't go towards the private market, but the para-governmental sectors like infrastructure, etc. So is it wrong to not invest more in the sectors that have a much higher multiplier? I think it's important to distinguish between the different multipliers. If you look at infrastructure, residential investments, they have a much bigger multiplier. They have a bigger effect on the GDP and the economy. Thank you. Thank you, Senator McAdam.
Being here, a number of my questions were already asked, but I have a few additional questions. So regarding the government's new capital budgeting framework, you've shared numerous times your views on government's definition of capital, that the government's definition of capital investments is overly expansive. And now the IMF's 2025 report on Canada indicates that while the new capital budgeting framework is a welcome step towards sharpening the focus on productive investment, further refinement is needed. So I'm wondering if you have any indication whether government intends to modify their definitions in the capital budgeting framework. Have you had any feedback on that or any information on that?
No, we haven't. I would say, based upon the number of times the International Monetary Fund is quoted in Budget 2025, it appears as if the government takes the IMF's recommendations very seriously.
We'll have to just wait and see. So switching over to the expenditure review, a number of questions were already asked, but I'm wondering, you did an interview with CTV recently, and CRA was highlighted as one of the organizations that didn't provide all the information that you requested. So did you get everything that you expected to get from CRA in the end?
We did.
Okay. And you indicated that you were able to substantiate approximately 80% of the plan with regards to the information that you had received from all the entities. So is it still 80%? Like, I'm just trying to get a sense of the additional work that you have to do.
So we're a little bit above 80%. In the note, and as part of the testimony that we provided to a committee in the other house last week, we indicated the number 80%. Some additional information has been provided, most notably from the Canada Revenue Agency, also Parks Canada. So we're a little bit above 80%. We're not at 100% yet, and we're still going through, as you can imagine, it's a substantial amount of information, so we're still reviewing it.
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to get some more information on the responses from departments and agencies on the assessments that they completed on service levels or the impact on service levels. So you talked a bit about this earlier, but I really wanted to get some clarity. When you ask these entities for information on the impact on service level, are you just looking for the existence of an assessment that they completed, or do you do any work on the assessments that they complete?
We do not. So when we do not undertake a review or an analysis of their plans, the plans provided by the government around managing service level impacts. At this point, again, we're focused more on the fiscal side as opposed to and the fiscal side is, as do deputy ministers of departments who have a legal responsibility under the Financial Administration Act to have a system of internal control in place in their departments when they sign off on the responses provided to our office saying we can cut 15% of our budget. and there will be lower limited service level impacts. We take that at face value. Deputy ministers are serious people. They're familiar with their legal accountabilities. So at this point, we haven't seen a need to go into it. That said, it's something that we will be following as the government starts to implement. So step one for us is to assess, okay, based upon the numbers that were in the budget, is there anything underneath the hood? And there appears to be. We're not at 100%, but we're close. Step two is to follow the implementation and to see, once the details are actually provided and parliamentarians and the public can see what the plans are, is everybody willing to go ahead with it once the plans actually see the light of day?
Okay, I think that's it for me because my other questions were already.
Merci. Thank you, Senator McAdam. Next question, Senatrice Hébert.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to come back to what my colleague Senator Galvez raised earlier. You said you were going to publish an analysis on the rates of return on investments. I think that would be very useful for us. But in the same vein as what you say in your report, when you say that you're looking at less optimistic scenarios on cost sharing, will you be providing different scenarios, for example, a more optimistic one, more pessimistic one, more conservative one? Because if you look at appreciation, we know that the results haven't always reflected expectations. If you look at housing, etc., things don't always happen the way we expect them to. So will you be producing that analysis on returns on investment, but according to different scenarios that could occur, especially in the context of the uncertainty that we're seeing today? Yes. If the committee recommends this type of analysis, it would be a pleasure. We will be publishing an analysis with different analysis based on the government's investments. And we can absolutely prepare different scenarios. Great. I think it would be interesting. We'll get back to you on that. Second question. When it comes to expenses, if I understand correctly, you asked the different departments to provide figures on their staff. Do the figures in your report include what we call the total cost related to labor? For example, I think we already asked your office to produce an analysis on the expenses related to insurance. So are those labor expenses included in the amounts that were provided to you, or it's only the salaries and benefits that are included in the amounts that you have in your table here? In the requests for information that we sent to departments, we didn't ask any specific questions on the categories and the details related to salaries and remuneration. We do have that data, and it is something that we analyze. We are preparing something about that, and it will be part of our analysis of the next budget predictions. Thank you. Senator Pupatello.
Around Buy Canada, and this budget is different in that I'm not sure there's been a budget that expressly says how to spend, not just how much, and in addition, where it's accounted for. So the difference in the capital and definition. So that's a bit new for this budget. And I'm curious if you can track the success of the spending where it's been identified for by Canada. Could you, or do you need a motion to do that kind of an analysis that in fact happens, and then you would identify where it isn't and why it isn't?
With the data we currently have, at our disposal, it would not be easy to track that. And thinking of Less by Canada and other types of spending, so other spending mandates provided by the government, and thinking, for example, of Indigenous spending. So there's nothing that we currently have that would allow us to do that. It's an interesting question, though, and with a motion from...
That the money that comes from the federal government through this budget that leverages other levels of government's funding that would, I'm assuming, also require a Buy Canada, regardless of whether that province has also enacted that. And some have. Some are already doing that. And then, because the government is going into the municipal level and regional as well to be matching or just handing over the money and then they do the spend, that it also hooks that spend into a Buy Canada. And how would you track that, given that you are looking at where it's landing? So it's not just an amount when it comes to capital, for example, so you're sort of getting into the policy of it. So in this case, how do you do that tracking of how it's spent?
As a first step, and given that it's a new policy, as a first step, I would use the economic and fiscal model that we currently have in place. So some of the variables, some of the things that we track as part of the economic model include how much of public sector or government spending, government consumption and investment is drawing upon the Canadian economy versus how much is flowing outside. So if there is a meaningful impact as a result of this policy across the entire Canadian economy, we should see those numbers change. There should be an inflection point, and so the data that's being pulled together from Statistics Canada, we should see that the historical trend based upon what we've seen in the past and where we are in the economy, there should be some sort of inflection point.
It's going to be a net figure as opposed to that spend is actually causing an internal spend.
Yeah, no, I got you on that.
It's too macro, I think, in that way.
I think I would say we could start with that. The challenge, because it's a new policy, the challenge of because first best, if you have infinite time and money, is to do a detailed bottom-up analysis, which of course my colleagues at PSPC are probably now feeling a little bit sick as I say this, but asking them to share the detailed data as part of the implementation or their real-time evaluation of the policy. We would love to look at it. We need a motion from the committee because it is very much on the fringe of our mandate. It's moving into ex post evaluation, which is something that the Auditor General would fit probably better in her mandate rather than ours. But I think as a first best, I guess part of all of the investment activity that the government's highlighted in Budget 2025, the government believes and has used public language that we are at an inflection point. So what we've seen in the past around the amount of investment in the economy as a result of federal and provincial and other activity, it's going to change. So we're going to see growth rates and investment tilt upward, productivity increase, and GDP growth increase, and standards of living increase in turn. That's something we're following very carefully to see if what's going to happen over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months is different than what we've seen in the past. But that's something we can certainly highlight in our upcoming economic and fiscal outlook for you.
Motion, Chair. Thank you.
Yes, we will have a couple of motions. They noted, and we will discuss at the next meeting. Okay, thank you. Moi, j'ai une question sur la réduction des effectifs.
I have a question on the workforce reduction. There seems to be some information about staff, but there's a table published by a Treasury Board, I believe, where we can follow the notices of WFA. And here's an example about notices saying a position is affected or could be affected on January 30th. The figure there was 21,180 non-executives and 88 executives only. When you look at the number of positions that have to be cut, 15,000 non-executives and 642 executives only. There seems to be a problem when it comes to proportions when you look at reductions of executive positions and non-executive positions. There seem to be far more cuts on the front lines than in the executive ranks. Did you notice that? And also, another thing, when we asked Treasury Board about this, because there was an increase in hiring in the last few years, but also an increase when it comes to salaries. And of course, there are percentages that you have to add every year, but also there's the issue of classification. So after I asked a question, we received the following information. The number of executives who earn more than $150,000 in 2021 versus 2025. And the answer for the category EX01, in 2021, there were 5 executives earning $500,000 or more, and in 2025, over 2,000. In EX02, in 2021, there were 6 people. In 2025, 1,935 earning more. So clearly, there's been a huge increase in terms of the cost, not only regarding the number of staff, but also the salaries. So I'm wondering why it is that there are so few EXs who are affected versus frontline employees. Do you have information about this? Am I interpreting the information incorrectly, or is this something that you intend to look into? We looked at the figures published by the Treasury Board Secretariat last week, and I have to mention that they published the information on positions rather than full-time equivalents, and so it's not clear how many people are working part-time versus full-time, and compared with the executives, I imagine that they work full-time. Question inaudible. Answer, exactly. It's interesting for us because when I saw that, I immediately had a few questions. In Budget 2025, there were figures published by the Government of Canada, 16,000 FTEs who will be cut because of the exercise. And looking at the figures, we asked the same question. There are around 13,000 positions, and with the TBS data, it's much higher. But then I realized that those figures had to do with people rather than FTEs. So it's a question of how the figures are presented. I can also say that I appeared before another committee at the other place, and there was the opinion, the notice rather, that was sent by TBS, including to our organization, that concerned a notice of reduction of EX positions. And the directive was to cut EX positions by 12% globally. There was an incredibly detailed notice, which I've never seen in the past. that had to do with the level of responsibility, and that was new. But if you look at the published figures, usually you try to cut at the different levels. You want to have a pretty direct access between the front lines and the deciders, but that doesn't get translated in the figures. So maybe following the directive that you just mentioned, it will change. But for the moment, this seems to be targeting frontline workers and not executives. With the figures that you have, what's been published, the official figures, yes. And so that's one reason why it's important to increase transparency so that we can work with the same figures and understand. Based on the questions that you asked, it may be worth asking the same questions to the chair, the president of the TBS. They are responsible for the human resources at the Government of Canada, and they may have an answer. Yes, indeed, we will certainly be asking them, and they are probably watching this, so I hope they have an answer ready. Thank you. We're finished, but I did interrupt Senator Forêt a little more quickly than the other people, so you had a little less time. You had a second question, so with your permission, Senator Forêt will ask his second question, because unless people used up all their time, they got 6 or 7 minutes. Thank you for your generosity and your fairness. And actually, my question has to do with the staff. The objective of reducing the number of staff to previous levels, if you look at the huge increase in hiring and the increase in budgets and the use of consultants, do you think that we'll be able to achieve those objectives without having a huge impact on services? I'm thinking of the CRA, of passport services, visa services. It seems to me that there's an issue there. And we'll see. With the data that we have from the 82 departments, it's clear that there will be a minimal impact on services. We'll see how it goes. One thing that was mentioned, I think at your committee, is that with the cuts, it's insane to simply reduce the number of positions, the number of consultants, but have the same number of activities. There's also the question of technology. It is probable, as we've seen in the past, something is going to break. And in our opinion, that's why it's so important to have a high level of transparency so that your committee can really dig down into the plan. If there's a plan to implement $60 billion in cuts over the next 5 years with a minimal impact throughout Canada, that's great. But maybe the Government of Canada should put their plan out there. Thank you, Mr. Jacques. Thank you to your colleagues also. It's always a pleasure to welcome you here, and thank you for your availability. You're always prepared to come, and you provide very precise answers to our questions, and it's much appreciated. And so we wish you a happy February and spring, and we hope to see you again with the same title, but not with the acting part of the title. Thank you. We'll